My father gave my brother $850,000 and mocked me to prove myself, so I built a secret firm with Grandpa's help. 2 years later, the lawyer read the trust aloud and my arrogant brother sneered, until he choked on his words as I forced him to work as my lowest apprentice. Welcome back to Vaughn's Rock Stories. Have you ever watched someone get handed every opportunity while you were told to earn everything yourself? If you've ever been underestimated by your own family, let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about family conflict, business battles, and hard-earned success, subscribe before we jump in. Because this story started with a birthday party. My name is Hannah Mercer. I'm 32 years old, and for most of my life, there was one thing everyone in my family understood without saying it. My younger brother Cole was the favorite. Nobody announced it. Nobody admitted it. But everyone knew. The Mercer family owned Mercer Building Products, one of the biggest companies in our area of Riverton, Kentucky. My grandfather Raymond built it. My father ran it. And most people assumed Cole would eventually inherit it, including Cole. By the time I turned 32, I wasn't trying to compete with him anymore. I had my own goals. In fact, I'd spent months quietly working on an idea for a financial consulting business. I wanted to help small companies manage cash flow, reduce debt, and grow sustainably. I hadn't told anyone yet, partly because I wasn't ready, partly because I was tired of hearing comparisons. The birthday celebration was held at one of the company event spaces. It wasn't just family. Managers were there, longtime employees, business associates, people who mattered. When I arrived, Cole was already surrounded by a crowd. That wasn't surprising. "Happy birthday, Hannah," my cousin Lisa said as she hugged me. "Thanks." She glanced toward Cole. "Your brother's been talking about his new company all evening." "Sounds about right." She laughed, then immediately looked uncomfortable. That told me everything. A few months earlier, Cole had announced plans to launch a business. Ever since then, every family gathering had somehow become a celebration of his future success. The evening moved along normally until my father stood and tapped his glass. The room quieted. He started talking about leadership, innovation, and the future. Every sentence seemed aimed directly at Cole. Then came the announcement. "Cole has shown tremendous vision," Dad said proudly. "And because I believe in that vision, I'm investing $850,000 into his company." The room erupted. People applauded. Managers congratulated him. Cole stood there grinning like he'd already won an award. I smiled politely. What else could I do? Then my father looked at me. The room seemed to quiet down again. "Hannah?" I sat up a little straighter. "You're smart," he said. "You've always been smart." For a second I thought maybe he was about to acknowledge me too. Instead, he smiled and said, "So if you believe in your abilities, prove it yourself." That was it. No investment, no support, no opportunity. Just prove it yourself. A few people shifted awkwardly in their seats. Someone looked down at their drink. Even the managers seemed uncomfortable. I felt my face grow hot. Not because I expected $850,000. What hurt was being compared to my brother in front of everyone. One child got a massive investment. The other got a challenge. I forced a smile. "Fair enough." Dad nodded as if he'd said something wise. The party continued, but it felt different after that. A few people quietly checked on me. Nobody said much. Nobody wanted to get involved. Later, Cole walked over holding a drink. "You okay?" he asked. "Why wouldn't I be?" He shrugged. "Dad's just trying to motivate you." I stared at him for a second. The crazy part was that he meant it. He honestly believed we'd both been treated fairly. "Congratulations, Cole." "Thanks." And just like that, he walked away to accept more congratulations. Eventually, the crowd started leaving. I grabbed my coat and headed toward the exit. That's when I noticed my grandfather. Raymond Mercer stood alone across the room. He wasn't talking to anyone, he was just watching. Watching me. Our eyes met. There was no pity in his expression. No disappointment either. It looked more like he was thinking. Like he'd just reached some kind of conclusion. Before I could walk over, someone crossed in front of me. A second later, Raymond was gone, and I couldn't stop wondering why he'd been looking at me that way. I spent the next few days pretending the birthday party hadn't bothered me. The problem was that other people clearly thought it had. My phone kept lighting up with messages from people who had been there. Most of them were short. "You handled that better than I would've. That couldn't have been easy. Just wanted you to know people noticed." That last one stuck with me. People noticed. For days, I'd been trying to convince myself that maybe I was being too sensitive. Maybe nobody else saw the difference between what my father gave Cole and what he gave me. Apparently they did. The sympathy was nice, but it didn't solve anything. Every morning, I woke up with the same question. What was I supposed to do now? I kept working on the business idea I'd been building in secret for months. Financial consulting, helping small businesses fix cash flow problems, manage debt, and make smarter growth decisions. Nothing flashy, no headlines, no investors. Just something I genuinely believed could help people. Most evenings were spent buried in spreadsheets and research. The deeper I dug, the more convinced I became there was a market for it. A lot of local businesses weren't struggling because they lacked customers. They were struggling because they lacked financial structure. The opportunity was there. My confidence wasn't. Starting a business sounded exciting when it was just an idea. Putting your own money on the line was different, especially when your father had publicly challenged you to prove yourself. Some days I felt motivated. Other days I wondered if he was right. Then I'd get annoyed with myself for even considering it. One afternoon, I met with a landscaping company owner I'd known casually for years. I'd been asking business owners questions whenever I had the chance. Near the end of our conversation, he looked at me and said, "So when are you launching?" I frowned. "Launching what?" "Your consulting firm." I laughed. "I haven't even started one. Not officially." The certainty in his voice surprised me. For some reason, he seemed more confident in my idea than I was. When I left the coffee shop, a news alert popped up on my phone. The photo showed Cole standing in front of a company banner, smiling for the camera. I opened the article. Local entrepreneur Cole Mercer announces ambitious new venture. There were quotes from investors, quotes from my father, quotes from Cole. The article made it sound like success was already guaranteed. I stared at it longer than I should have, not because I hated seeing him succeed. It was because nobody had asked him to prove anything first. The confidence had already been handed to him. I closed the article and shoved my phone into my pocket. A few days later, my mother called. Not to talk about the birthday, not to ask how I was doing. She wanted to know if I was coming to a family dinner. I might skip it. A pause. "Hannah, I'm busy. You've been distant lately." I almost laughed. "Distant?" "Yes. I've just been working." Another pause. Then she said, "Your father was only trying to help." There it was. The familiar defense. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. For the first time in years, I was tired of trying to make people understand. "Tell everyone I said hello." Then I ended the call. The more space I put between myself and the family, the easier it became to focus. Little by little, the business stopped feeling like a fantasy. It started feeling possible. One evening, I was reviewing notes at my kitchen table when my phone rang. The caller ID made me sit up immediately. Raymond Mercer, my grandfather. He wasn't the type to call without a reason. I answered. "Hi, Grandpa. Hannah?" His voice was calm. "Are you free tomorrow afternoon?" "I think so." "I'd like you to come by my office." That caught me off guard. "Everything okay?" "Yes. A brief silence followed. Then he added, "Come alone." I frowned. "Is this about something specific?" "It is." "Nothing else? No explanation, no details. Just a time. Just an address I already knew." The call ended a few seconds later. And for the rest of the evening, I couldn't stop wondering why my grandfather wanted to see me without anyone else knowing. I spent the drive to my grandfather's office wondering why he wanted to see me alone. Raymond Mercer wasn't the kind of person who made mysterious phone calls for no reason. When I arrived, his assistant smiled and pointed me toward his office. "He's waiting for you." That did nothing to calm my nerves. A minute later, I was sitting across from him. He glanced up from a stack of papers. "You're on time." "Barely." A faint smile crossed his face. Then he asked a question I wasn't expecting. "How's your business idea coming?" I blinked. "My what?" "The consulting firm." For a second, I just stared at him. I hadn't told my parents. I hadn't told Cole. I hadn't told most people. "How do you know about that?" "You'd be surprised what I hear." Then he leaned back. "Tell me about it." That was it. No mention of the birthday party, no family drama, no lecture, just business. So I explained everything. The financial consulting idea, the small businesses I'd been researching, the cash flow issues I kept seeing, the debt problems, the planning mistakes. The more I talked, the more questions he asked. "What makes you different from larger firms? How will you find clients? What happens if revenue takes longer than expected? How much risk are you willing to take?" At first, I thought he was curious. Then I realized he was evaluating me. A few times I admitted I didn't have an answer. Surprisingly, that seemed to impress him more than when I tried sounding confident. By the end, the conversation felt less like a meeting with my grandfather and more like an interview with an investor. Then he opened a drawer and pulled out a folder. Inside were notes. My notes. At least some of them. I frowned. "Wait. You've seen these before?" "I have." "Why?" "Because I've been paying attention." That caught me off guard. Growing up, Raymond always seemed focused on the company. He wasn't someone who hovered over family members. The fact that he'd noticed what I was doing was surprising enough. What he said next surprised me even more. "Hannah, do you know why I asked you to come here alone?" I shook my head. "Because I wanted to hear your ideas without anyone else speaking for you." The room went quiet. It sounds simple. But when you've spent years being compared to your sibling, a sentence like that hits differently. Nobody ever seemed interested in what I thought. They wanted to know how I compared to Cole. Raymond was asking about me. For the first time in a long time, I felt seen. The conversation continued for nearly another hour. He asked about people I'd helped over the years, local contractors, small family businesses, store owners who occasionally called me when they were stuck on financial decisions. I always thought those were just favors. Raymond clearly didn't. He wanted details, results, outcomes, what worked and what didn't. Not once did he bring up family politics. Not once did he mention inheritance. Just business. Finally, he stood. "Come with me." I followed him through another section of the building. Most of it was empty. Unused offices, old meeting rooms, space nobody seemed to need anymore. Then he unlocked a door. Inside was a modest office suite. Nothing fancy. A few desks, some cabinets. Enough room for a small company. I looked around. "This place is empty." "It is." "Why are you showing me this?" He folded his arms. "Because if you decide to move forward, you can use it." I stared at him. "You'd let me work here?" "Yes." For the first time since my birthday, I felt something other than frustration. Possibility. Someone actually believed I could build something. Not because I was part of the Mercer family. Because they believed I was capable. When I finally got ready to leave, Raymond stopped me at the door. Hannah. I turned. His expression had grown serious. If you're serious about building this. He paused. We need to talk again next week. Then he returned to his desk, and I spent the entire walk to my car wondering what he planned to say next. The empty office looked a lot more impressive the day I received the keys. It looked a lot less impressive a week later. By then, I had discovered something every business owner eventually learns. Starting a company sounds exciting. Running one is mostly paperwork. I officially registered Mercer Financial Solutions and moved into the office Raymond had offered me. The first morning felt incredible. I unlocked the door, sat at my desk, and looked around at a space that was finally mine. Then reality arrived. There were no employees, no clients, no revenue, just me, and a very long to-do list. I built the website myself, created marketing materials myself, answered emails myself, scheduled meetings myself. If something needed to be done, it became my responsibility. Some days I spent more time dealing with administrative work than actual consulting. Nobody talks about that part when they tell success stories. The first few weeks were especially awkward. Every meeting felt like a job interview. Potential clients wanted to know who I was, what experience I had, and why they should trust me. Sometimes those conversations went well, sometimes they didn't. One business owner looked at my last name on a proposal and immediately smiled. Mercer? Yes. As in, Mercer Building Products? I nodded. His smile got even bigger. Oh, so your family is backing this. The excitement in his voice disappeared when I answered. No. This is my company. The room went quiet. A few minutes later, the meeting ended politely. I never heard from him again. That wasn't the last time it happened. Some people assumed I had unlimited resources because of my family. Others assumed I had connections that guaranteed success. A few believed I was only getting opportunities because of my last name. Ironically, the Mercer name opened some doors and closed others. The more it happened, the more frustrating it became. I wanted people to judge my work, not my family. One afternoon, I vented about it during a meeting with Raymond. I feel like nobody sees me, I admitted. They see the last name first. He nodded calmly. That's normal. Normal. Success creates assumptions. I laughed. I haven't succeeded yet. Doesn't matter, the assumptions are already there. That sounded unfair, but the longer I thought about it, the more I realized he was right. Every advantage came with baggage. The question was whether I could work through it. The months kept moving. Slowly, things improved. A contractor referred me to another contractor. A local retailer recommended me to a friend. One client became two. Two became four. The money wasn't life-changing, but it was real. For the first time, people were paying me for my expertise. Not because of my family, because I helped solve problems. One Friday afternoon, I sat alone reviewing monthly numbers. They weren't spectacular, but they were moving in the right direction. I caught myself smiling. A few months earlier, this business had only existed inside a notebook. Now it existed in the real world. That feeling carried me through a lot of difficult days, especially when I heard updates about Cole. His company seemed to be growing at lightning speed. New hires, new projects, new announcements. Every family gathering included another story about his success. At dinner one evening, an uncle asked how things were going. Before I could answer, Cole jumped in. Hannah's still building her client list. Still, it was a small word, but it carried a lot of weight. A few relatives chuckled politely. I noticed it. So did Raymond. He didn't say anything. He rarely did in those moments, but I noticed him watching. The same way he'd watched me at my birthday party. A few days later, he invited me back to his office. That wasn't unusual anymore. By then, our meetings had become a regular thing. We talked about clients, growth, mistakes, strategy. Sometimes I felt like I was getting a free business education. When I walked into his office that afternoon, he was already seated behind his desk. Something was different. A thick folder sat beside him, far thicker than anything he'd shown me before. I took my usual seat. Raymond placed one hand on top of the folder and looked directly at me. Then he slowly pushed it across the desk. "I think it's time we discuss the next step." And for the first time, I found myself wondering what exactly he had been preparing all this time. I looked down at the thick folder sitting on Raymond's desk, then back at him. "What exactly is this?" He folded his hands. "An opportunity." That wasn't a very helpful answer. I opened the folder. The first few pages contained business documents, financial projections, administrative forms, growth plans. The deeper I went, the more confused I became. Finally, I looked up. "Grandpa, what am I looking at?" He slid a single page toward me. My eyes landed on one number, $55,000. I blinked, then looked again. The number didn't change. For a few seconds, I genuinely didn't know what to say. "You're investing in the company?" "I'm willing to." The room suddenly felt very quiet. Just months earlier, my father had handed Cole $850,000 in front of an audience. Now Raymond was offering me something very different, not nearly as much money, but somehow it felt more significant, because he had actually listened to me first. "Why?" I asked. His answer came immediately. "Because you've done the work." Simple, direct. No speeches, no comparisons. Just those 4 words. I looked back down at the documents. The money would solve several problems immediately. I could improve my marketing, upgrade software, build a proper client management system, maybe even hire part-time help eventually. For the first time since launching the business, growth felt realistic. Then I noticed something. Several pages were highlighted. Additional requirements, detailed requirements. A lot of them. I started reading. The farther I went, the more my excitement slowed. Every expense had to be documented. Every investment tracked. Major business decisions needed written records. Client growth reports had to be maintained. Financial statements had to be organized and archived. There were even sections about third-party verification. I looked up. "That's a lot." "It is." "You want documentation for everything?" "Yes." I laughed. "Everything?" "Everything." His expression never changed. I wasn't sure if he was joking. Unfortunately, he wasn't. I flipped through another section. There were templates, tracking forms, reporting structures, verification procedures. It looked less like an investment package and more like an auditing system. "Grandpa, this is enough paperwork to scare people away." "Good." I stared at him. "Good?" People who avoid accountability usually avoid documentation. I couldn't argue with that. Didn't mean I liked it. For the next half hour, we went through the requirements one by one. Some made perfect sense. Others felt excessive. At least to me. Eventually, I pointed to one section. "You even want outside verification?" "On certain records." "Why?" "Because independent verification removes doubt." That answer raised more questions than it solved. The strange part was that Raymond wasn't acting like an investor protecting his money. He was acting like a teacher making sure I learned something. The more we talked, the more obvious it became. This wasn't really about $55,000. The money mattered. But the system mattered more. Every decision would leave a trail. Every success could be proven. Every mistake could be tracked. Nothing would depend on memory. Nothing would depend on opinions. Everything would depend on evidence. By the end of the meeting, my initial resistance had faded. I still thought some of it was excessive. But I also trusted him. More than that, I respected him. If Raymond Mercer believed this process mattered, there was probably a reason. I signed the agreement. Not because it was easy, because it felt right. As I gathered the documents, Raymond carefully placed the folder back on his desk. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then I asked the question that had been bothering me since the beginning. Why is all of this necessary? He studied me for several seconds, long enough that I thought he might actually explain. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and gave a small smile. One day you'll understand. That was it. No further explanation, no additional clues, just a calm certainty that somehow made me even more curious than before. The first year of Mercer Financial Solutions was a lot less glamorous than people imagine when they hear the words business owner. Most days I was tired, not defeated, just tired. The kind of tired that comes from wearing 10 different hats at once. I was still handling client meetings, reports, billing, marketing, and administrative work. The difference was that I wasn't doing it for free anymore. Clients were starting to arrive. Slowly, one referral became another. A contractor recommended me to a supplier. That supplier recommended me to a local retailer. The retailer introduced me to another business owner. Nothing exploded overnight. The company grew one relationship at a time. And honestly, I preferred it that way. People weren't hiring me because of advertising. They were hiring me because someone they trusted had seen results. One afternoon, I received a handwritten thank you note from a client whose company had avoided bankruptcy after we restructured their debt payments. It wasn't a huge account. The note probably meant more to me than the payment. I pinned it beside my desk. On difficult days, it reminded me why I started. Not everyone saw things that way, especially my family. At nearly every gathering, somebody found a way to compare me to Cole, usually without realizing how obvious they were being. Did you hear about Cole's new office? Cole hired 6 more employees. Cole's company is expanding again. The comments never sounded hostile. They somehow felt worse because they sounded normal, as if everybody had already decided who the success story was. To be fair, from the outside, they weren't wrong. Cole's company looked impressive. He leased a large office downtown. He hired aggressively. He appeared in local business magazines. Photos of ribbon-cutting ceremonies seemed to appear every few weeks. Everything about his business projected growth. Everything about mine projected patience. Guess which one attracted more attention? During one family dinner, an uncle asked how business was going. Before I could answer, Cole grinned. Hannah's still building. That word again. Still. A few people laughed. Not cruelly. Just enough. Cole leaned back in his chair. Hey, somebody has to take care of the small guys. More laughter. I noticed my father smiling into his drink. That bothered me more than Cole's joke. A year earlier, I would have defended myself, explained my numbers, talked about client retention, tried to prove my progress. I didn't do any of that. Instead, I took another bite of dinner. The silence seemed to confuse Cole. What? He asked. I shrugged. Nothing. For the first time, I genuinely didn't need his approval. Or my father's. That realization surprised me. Not because I suddenly stopped caring, because I finally had something else to care about. My own company. My own clients. My own future. The comparisons didn't disappear. I just stopped participating in them. Raymond noticed. He noticed everything. During one of our regular meetings, he asked, "You didn't respond to Cole." Didn't seem necessary. A small smile appeared. Good. That was all he said. But somehow it felt like approval. The second year moved faster. My client list continued growing. Revenue became more predictable. The mountain of documentation Raymond insisted on was becoming routine. I still thought some of it was excessive, but every report, contract, and financial record was organized exactly where it should be. Raymond never stopped checking, and I never stopped learning. Then something happened that caught me completely off guard. I was finishing paperwork late one afternoon when my assistant buzzed my office. "You have a call." "Who is it?" There was a brief pause. "He says he used to work with your brother." That got my attention. "Did he leave a name?" "Yes." She told me. I recognized it immediately. The man had been connected to one of Cole's larger projects. I picked up the call. "Hello?" The voice on the other end sounded hesitant. "Ms. Mercer?" "Speaking." Another pause. Then he lowered his voice slightly. "I was hoping you could help me." "With what?" His answer came quickly. "My company has some serious financial problems." I frowned. "And?" Another silence, long enough to feel uncomfortable. Finally, he said, "Those problems started after we signed a contract with Cole." I stayed on the phone with the former client for nearly an hour. By the end of the conversation, I wasn't shocked, just concerned. The issues he described weren't dramatic scandals. They were the kind of problems that quietly destroy businesses over time. Projects expanding faster than expected. Costs increasing without proper controls. Budgets being revised over and over again. Too much money going out. Not enough coming back. Before we ended the call, he sighed. "I thought we were partnering with a stable company." "What happened?" I asked. "I honestly don't know anymore." That answer stuck with me, because it wasn't coming from a competitor. It was coming from someone who had worked directly with Cole's business. Over the following months, I heard similar stories, never from the same source, never with exactly the same details. But the pattern was familiar. Large contracts, aggressive expansion, growing expenses, unclear profitability, nothing that proved disaster, just enough to make me pay attention. The strange thing was that none of it matched Cole's public image. Online, everything looked perfect. New announcements, new hires, new projects. The company appeared unstoppable. If you've ever seen a business from the outside versus the inside, you know those can be two very different stories. I kept most of my thoughts to myself. For one thing, I didn't have all the facts. For another, I had enough work managing my own company. Mercer Financial Solutions continued growing steadily. Not explosively, steadily. And I was starting to appreciate the difference. Every new client improved our foundation. Every successful project strengthened our reputation. There were no shortcuts, no dramatic headlines, just consistent progress. One evening at a family dinner, the comparison game started again. An aunt mentioned another expansion announcement from Cole's company. My father immediately smiled. "That's what ambition looks like." The table went quiet for a second. Not because of what he said, because everyone understood what he meant. Cole grinned into his drink. I focused on my food. A year earlier, that comment would have bothered me. Now it mostly felt predictable. My father noticed my lack of reaction. That seemed to irritate him more than an argument would have. "Hannah," he said, "you could learn something from your brother's willingness to take risks." Before I could answer, Cole jumped in. "Dad, don't be hard on her." His tone sounded playful. The smile on his face didn't. "Not everybody wants to build something big." A few relatives laughed. I didn't. Neither did Raymond. He sat quietly at the far end of the table, observing everyone. As usual, the conversation moved on. But I noticed something. My father had become increasingly protective whenever anyone questioned Cole. Even mildly, any criticism was immediately explained away. Any concern became jealousy. Any problem became temporary. It was as if he needed the success story to be true. A few days later, Raymond called me into his office again. That wasn't unusual anymore. What was unusual was his request. "I need copies of everything." I looked up from my coffee. "Everything?" "Every report, every major client file, every financial statement." I laughed. You already have most of that. I want updated copies. That sounded excessive even for him. Still, I agreed. By then, documenting everything had become second nature. The paperwork that once annoyed me barely registered anymore. A week later, I arrived carrying 2 organized boxes of records: contracts, reports, revenue summaries, verification documents. The usual mountain of paperwork Raymond loved. His assistant waved me toward the office. When I stepped inside, something immediately caught my attention. Raymond was sitting behind his desk with several legal files spread open in front of him. Thick legal files. Not business reports. Legal documents. The moment he saw me, he closed them. Quickly. Not panicked. Just fast enough that I noticed. For a brief second, I caught a glimpse of signatures, attorney letterhead, and several tabs sticking out from the folders. Then they were gone. Locked beneath his hand. Neither of us mentioned it. Instead, I placed my boxes on the desk. Requested paperwork delivery. A faint smile appeared. Excellent. But as he started reviewing the files I'd brought, I couldn't stop thinking about the documents he'd hidden the moment I walked into the room. He's slowing down. That was how Raymond's assistant described it. Simple, matter of fact. But I knew what she meant. Over the previous few months, I'd started noticing small changes. Nothing dramatic. Just little things. He canceled meetings more often, worked shorter days, took longer pauses during conversations. The sharpness was still there. The energy wasn't. The first time it really hit me was when he stopped midway through one of our regular discussions and rubbed his eyes. "You okay?" I asked. "Just tired." For some reason, that answer bothered me. Raymond Mercer had never seemed tired before. He always looked like the strongest person in every room. Seeing even a small crack in that image felt strange. The business meetings continued, but they gradually changed. We still talked about clients. We still reviewed reports. We still discussed growth strategies. But more and more often, our conversations drifted into something else. Responsibility, leadership, decision-making. The things nobody teaches you when you're starting a company. One afternoon, he reviewed a client report, closed the file, and asked, "What's the hardest part of running a business?" I expected a trick question. Instead, I answered honestly, "Making decisions when nobody can guarantee you're right." He smiled. Good answer. Then he spent 20 minutes talking about consequences. Not success, not profit. Consequences. According to Raymond, most people loved rewards. Very few wanted responsibility. The older I got, the more I realized he was probably right. Another change happened around that time. Family gatherings became easier for me, not because my family had changed, because I had. The constant need for approval was fading. My company was stable. Clients trusted me. The work mattered. For the first time in my life, I wasn't measuring myself against Cole. Ironically, that made my conversations with Raymond feel even more important. He wasn't interested in comparing us. He never had been. One evening, we sat in his office long after business had ended. The sun was setting outside. No reports, no spreadsheets, just conversation. He asked about a client who had recently expanded. I asked about the early years of Mercer building products. For nearly an hour, he told stories I'd never heard before. Mistakes, failures, deals that almost collapsed. Years when the company barely stayed afloat. It was oddly comforting. Growing up, family success had always been presented as something inevitable. Raymond described it differently, like a long series of difficult choices. Before I left, he said something that stayed with me. People think wealth protects them from consequences. I looked at him. It doesn't? A quiet smile appeared. No. Then he added, it usually delays them. I thought about that all the way home. As the months passed, his health continued declining, not rapidly, but enough that everyone noticed. Family members started visiting more often. Phone calls increased. Schedules changed. Nobody said the words out loud. Nobody needed to. The situation was obvious. One afternoon, I arrived for a meeting and found him looking out the window instead of reviewing paperwork. That alone felt unusual. He motioned toward a chair. When I sat down, he didn't immediately start talking about business. Instead, he asked, "What do you think people get wrong about inheritance?" The question surprised me. "I don't know." "I do." His voice remained calm. "They think inheritance is a reward." I waited. "It's actually a responsibility." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he continued. "The wrong person can destroy in 5 years what took 50 years to build." That sounded less like business advice and more like a warning. I wasn't sure who he was talking about. Maybe nobody specific. Maybe somebody very specific. Before I could ask, he changed the subject. That was another thing Raymond did well. He always seemed to know exactly how much he wanted to reveal. When I stood to leave, he remained seated behind his desk. For a moment, he looked older than I'd ever seen him. Not weak, just tired. The conversation seemed over. Then he spoke again. His voice was quiet, almost reflective. "Sometimes family becomes angriest when people are forced to face the consequences of their own choices." I stopped near the door. The comment felt oddly specific. But when I turned back toward him, Raymond was already looking down at the papers on his desk. As if the conversation had ended. As if he hadn't just given me something to think about for the rest of the week. The call came early in the morning. Even before I answered, I knew. Some news announces itself before a single word is spoken. When I picked up, my mother's voice sounded strained. "Hannah." That was enough. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said the words I'd been expecting for weeks, but still wasn't ready to hear. "Grandpa passed away last night." I sat there quietly. My coffee grew cold beside me. The room suddenly felt much larger than it had a minute earlier. Raymond had prepared me for many things: business setbacks, difficult decisions, responsibility. What he hadn't prepared me for was the silence that follows losing someone who genuinely believed in you. The funeral brought the entire family together. Relatives I hadn't seen in years appeared. Old business associates arrived. Former employees came to pay their respects. Listening to people talk about Raymond was strangely comforting. Everyone seemed to have a story, a lesson, a memory, something he'd said years earlier that they still remembered. That sounded exactly like him. For most of the service, I kept finding myself looking toward the front row out of habit, then remembering why he wasn't there. The days after the funeral felt even stranger. When you're busy planning services and greeting relatives, there's always something to do. Once everyone starts going home, the reality settles in, and reality felt heavy. A few days later, several family members gathered at my parents' house. The atmosphere wasn't exactly relaxed. People were grieving, but something else had started creeping into conversations: expectations, assumptions, predictions. Nobody said the word inheritance directly at first. They didn't need to. An uncle eventually broke the ice. "So what's the plan for Mercer Building Products now?" That opened the floodgates. Everyone suddenly had opinions. Most of them sounded remarkably similar. My father would remain in control. Or eventually, Cole would take over. Those were the two possibilities people discussed. Nobody seemed interested in a third option. Not that I expected them to be. I wasn't even thinking about that myself. I was still thinking about Raymond. Cole, however, appeared to have moved on much faster than the rest of us. At one dinner gathering, he was already talking about future expansion plans. "I think the company needs a more aggressive strategy." A few relatives nodded. Cole continued, "We should probably look at regional acquisitions within the next few years." My father smiled proudly. The conversation carried on as if major decisions were already waiting for Cole to approve. I sat quietly, listening. Part of me found it uncomfortable. Another part found it oddly revealing. Nobody was asking what Raymond wanted. They were discussing what they assumed would happen. The certainty in the room surprised me, especially because I remembered those legal files Raymond had hidden when I walked into his office months earlier. I remembered the endless documentation, the outside verification, the detailed records he insisted on keeping. At the time, none of it had made sense. Now, I wasn't so sure. One evening, I found myself sitting alone in my office after everyone else had left. The building was quiet. For the first time in years, I couldn't call Raymond if I needed advice. That realization hit harder than I expected. I opened one of the filing cabinets and looked at the neatly organized records we'd built together. Contracts, reports, financial statements, every document exactly where it belonged. For a few minutes, I simply stared at them. Then I closed the drawer. Because whether I understood it or not, Raymond had clearly believed those records mattered. A week later, an email arrived from Evelyn Price, the family's attorney. The subject line immediately caught everyone's attention. A formal reading of Raymond Mercer's trust had been scheduled. The date, the time, the location. Everything was official. By the end of the day, the entire family was talking about it. And judging by the confidence in my father's voice and the grin on Cole's face, neither of them expected any surprises. The conference room felt smaller than it actually was. Maybe it was the tension. Maybe it was the number of people squeezed around the table. Or maybe it was the fact that everyone had arrived expecting one outcome. My father sat confidently near the front. Cole looked even more relaxed. He was dressed like someone attending a board meeting he already controlled. Evelyn Price, Raymond's attorney, sat at the head of the table with several folders stacked neatly in front of her. The room gradually quieted. Then she began. The first part was routine. Legal language, trust structure, asset summaries, ownership details. Most people listened politely. A few barely paid attention. Cole certainly didn't seem worried. Neither did my father. That changed about 20 minutes later. Evelyn opened another folder. Before discussing control provisions, there are several directives left by Raymond Mercer that must be reviewed. The room became noticeably more attentive. Control provisions. That was the part everyone cared about. Evelyn adjusted her glasses and continued. Mr. Mercer specifically stated that leadership authority over trust-controlled business assets would not automatically transfer based solely on family position or blood relation. For the first time, I saw confusion appear on several faces. My father frowned. Cole sat up slightly. Evelyn kept reading. The trust outlined a philosophy Raymond had apparently spent years developing. According to him, inherited authority created risk when it wasn't supported by demonstrated capability. Control should be earned, not assumed. The room was silent. I remembered all those conversations about responsibility, all those discussions about consequences. Suddenly, they felt much more important. My father raised a hand. What exactly does that mean? Evelyn glanced down at the document. It means leadership eligibility is determined by specific criteria established by Mr. Mercer. The confidence around the room began fading. Even I wasn't sure where this was going. She continued reading. Candidates needed documented evidence of building and managing an independent business. They needed verifiable records, operational history, financial performance, administrative accountability. Everything had to be supported by documentation, not claims, not projections, evidence. As Evelyn listed requirement after requirement, an uncomfortable feeling spread through the room, because very few people seemed aware these conditions existed. Cole shifted in his chair. My father looked increasingly uneasy. I sat quietly, listening. Then something strange happened. My name appeared. At first it was brief. Just a reference within one section. I assumed it was incidental. Then it appeared again. And again. The room noticed. So did I. Evelyn referenced meetings, business reports, investment records, independent documentation. Every mention pointed back to the same person. Me. Cole finally interrupted. Why does Hannah keep coming up? The question hung in the air. Nobody answered immediately. Evelyn simply turned another page. The trust references documented business development activities reviewed by Mr. Mercer during his lifetime. My stomach tightened. I wasn't expecting this. Neither was anyone else. Across the table, my father looked completely confused. Cole looked irritated. For the first time all morning, he seemed genuinely concerned. The reading continued. Every new section revealed another layer of preparation Raymond had quietly put into place. Years of preparation. Years, not months. Not last-minute decisions. Years. Suddenly, those legal files I'd once seen on Raymond's desk made sense. The attorney meetings, the paperwork, the endless documentation requirements. He hadn't been acting randomly. He'd been building something. And apparently, he'd been building it for a long time. Evelyn finally closed one folder. Then she reached for another. A much thicker one. The room watched her. Nobody spoke. She looked directly toward me, then toward the rest of the family. Her voice remained calm. Before eligibility determinations can be finalized, Mr. Mercer's instructions require that supporting documentation be entered into the record. My heartbeat sped up. Evelyn placed her hand on the folder. That includes the complete investment history, business development records, verification reports, and operational documentation associated with Hannah Mercer's company. The room went completely silent. Every head turned toward me, and Evelyn began opening the file. One folder after another had confirmed the same thing. Every requirement Raymond had written into the trust matched records connected to my business. The investment agreement, the financial reports, the third-party verifications, the growth records, everything. For years, I'd thought Raymond was simply being overly careful. Now everyone could see there had been a reason. Evelyn closed the final folder. Based on the trust provisions and supporting documentation, Hannah Mercer satisfies the qualifications established by Raymond Mercer for management authority over the trust-controlled assets. Nobody reacted immediately. Cole looked stunned. My father looked confused. Then came the objections. That can't be right, Cole said. Evelyn didn't flinch. It is. My father leaned forward. You're saying Hannah gets control of everything? I'm saying Raymond's trust determines leadership through documented performance, not family position. The tension in the room grew heavier. Cole turned toward me. You were around Grandpa constantly. You influenced him. I stared at him for a second. Influenced him to do what? Make me keep paperwork for 2 years? A few people shifted uncomfortably. The accusation didn't hold up for long. Every document had dates. Every major decision had witnesses. Most had been prepared years before Raymond's health declined. The more Evelyn explained, the weaker their argument became. Eventually, there wasn't much left to say. The trust was valid. The evidence was clear. And the chances of overturning it were almost non-existent. When the meeting ended, people left quietly. Some offered congratulations. Some avoided eye contact. My father walked out without speaking to me. Cole followed a few seconds later. Oddly enough, I didn't chase either of them. For years, I probably would have. Now, I just felt tired. A few weeks later, I officially became the managing trustee and assumed leadership responsibilities at Mercer Building Products. There was no dramatic celebration. Mostly there were meetings, budgets, problems, deadlines, real work. The company needed stability, and that became my focus. One afternoon, Cole requested a meeting. He walked into my office looking irritated before the conversation even started. "So what happens now?" he asked. I slid a folder across the desk. He opened it. His expression immediately darkened. "This is a job offer." "It is." "You want me working under department managers?" "I want you in a position with real responsibilities." He looked at me for several seconds. "No special treatment?" I shook my head. "The same standards everyone else follows." For a moment I thought he would throw the folder back at me. Instead, he stood up, grabbed it, and walked out. That was the end of the conversation, at least for then. Some family relationships improved slowly afterward. Others stayed strained. Not every wound disappeared. Not every disagreement got resolved. Life rarely works that neatly. One evening, I stayed late at the small office Raymond had loaned me when all this began. The place was quiet. I opened an old filing cabinet packed with reports and records. Years of documentation. The same paperwork I'd once complained about. I ran my hand across the folders and finally understood. Raymond wasn't preparing an heir. He was testing people, testing discipline, testing responsibility, testing who could keep building when nobody was coming to rescue them. The trust wasn't really about who deserved money. It was about who could be trusted with what had already been built. And sitting there alone in that office, I realized something else. I no longer needed my father's approval. I no longer needed Cole to admit I was capable. The work had already answered that question. Sometimes, the most valuable thing you build isn't a business. It's the proof that you can stand on your own when nobody believes you can. If this story connected with you, share it with someone who might need that reminder. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments and what you would have done in Hannah's position. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.